The thunder rolled across the Montana sky as Parker Buchanan drove his herd into the safety of the corral, rain already beginning to pelt the dusty earth of his ranch. The year was 1876, and like the storm clouds gathering overhead, darkness had settled over his heart for the past 3 years. Not since Sarah had died in childbirth, taking their unborn son with her to the grave, had he allowed himself to feel anything beyond the burning determination to keep his ranch running and his promises intact. "Get a move on," Parker shouted to his ranch hands as they secured the gate. His voice carried the rough edge that had become his trademark since that fateful day. At 32, the lines around his eyes spoke of both sun exposure and sorrow, his once easy smile now a distant memory to those who'd known him before. Thunder cracked again as Parker dismounted his chestnut mare, his boots sinking slightly into the mud forming beneath him. Yanking off his rain-soaked hat, he ran a hand through his dark hair, now plastered to his forehead. The Double B Ranch had been his dream, built with Sarah at his side. Now it was just his burden to bear his penance, perhaps, for failing to save her. "Buchanan," called Hank, his foreman of 6 years. "Storm's getting worse. Got word from town that the Miller Creek Bridge is already washing out. Anybody caught on the wrong side won't be making it across tonight." Parker nodded grimly. "Get the boys inside. No sense risking pneumonia when there's work to be done tomorrow." He cast one final glance at the darkening sky before heading toward his barn to check on the new foal born just days before. The massive wooden structure loomed ahead, a testament to his craftsmanship and the dreams he once harbored. Inside, the familiar scents of hay, leather, and horses greeted him, along with the soft nickering of the animals seeking shelter from the deluge. Parker moved with purpose toward the stall where the mare and her foal rested, stopping short when he heard a sound that didn't belong, a shuffle. Then a quiet curse in a distinctly feminine voice. Drawing his Colt revolver from its holster, Parker moved silently toward the source of the sound, coming around the corner of a stall to find a woman soaked to the bone and attempting to wring water from a blue traveling dress that had seen better days. "You're trespassing," he said coldly, keeping his gun trained on her. "This is private property." The woman gasped, spinning around with eyes wide as summer skies. She raised her hands, water dripping from her sleeves. "I'm sorry, the storm. I was just seeking shelter until it passes." Parker kept his expression hard, unmoved by her beauty, despite the unbidden notice his mind took of her delicate features, framed by wet tendrils of honey-blonde hair escaping what had once been a neat arrangement. "There's a town 12 miles east, plenty of proper places for a lady to stay." She lowered her hands slightly, a flash of defiance crossing her face. 12 miles might as well be 100 in this weather, sir. My wagon wheel broke 3 miles back. I walked until I found your barn." "Alone?" Parker questioned suspiciously, though he kept his gun steady. "Yes, alone." She met his gaze, and something in her direct stare made him uncomfortably aware of how long it had been since he'd looked a woman in the eyes. Then, inexplicably, despite her bedraggled appearance and precarious situation, she smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or even a pleading one. It was genuine, with a hint of irony at her predicament, and it reached her eyes in a way that made them crinkle at the corners. "I realize this isn't proper, but I promise I'm not here to rob you or cause trouble. I'm Katherine Evans. Most people call me Kate." The smile struck Parker like a physical blow. He holstered his gun with a grunt, telling himself it was only common decency not to threaten a woman clearly in distress. "Parker Buchanan, this is my ranch." "Thank you for not shooting me, Mr. Buchanan," she said, that smile still lingering at the corners of her mouth. Parker turned away abruptly, disturbed by the way his chest had tightened at the sight of her smile. "You can stay until the storm passes, not a minute longer." He moved to a storage area, pulling out a rough wool blanket. Tossing it in her direction without looking at her, he added, "Dry yourself off. Catch your death in here, and I'll have paperwork to deal with." Katherine caught the blanket, her smile fading at his coldness. "You're very kind," she said, with just enough sarcasm to make him turn back toward her. "I'm practical, Miss Evans, nothing more." He nodded toward an empty stall with fresh hay. You can rest there if you need to. I'll be tending to my horses." For the next hour, Parker busied himself with unnecessary tasks, acutely aware of the woman's presence despite the large space between them. She had wrapped herself in the blanket and settled in the stall he'd indicated, occasionally glancing his way when she thought he wasn't looking. The rain continued to pound against the roof, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the barn's interior through the high windows. After checking on the foal twice more than necessary, Parker reluctantly approached Katherine, who sat with her back against the stall wall, her traveling bag beside her. "Storm's not letting up," he said gruffly. "You'd better come to the house. There's a spare room you can use for the night." Katherine looked up, surprise evident on her face. "Are you certain? I wouldn't want to impose further." "It's practical," Parker repeated, as if convincing himself. "Barn's no place for a lady to spend the night, and I don't need the guilt if you take ill." She stood, gathering her damp bag. "Thank you, Mr. Buchanan." The walk to the main house was a silent, wet affair. Parker led the way, turning occasionally to make sure Katherine was keeping pace. The two-story ranch house stood proudly against the storm, lights visible through windows where his housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, had already lit lamps. Upon entering, the warmth and smell of fresh bread was a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. Parker removed his hat and coat, gesturing for Katherine to do the same. "My word," exclaimed Mrs. Abernathy, a stout woman in her 50s who had kept Parker's house since before Sarah died. "Who might this be, Mr. Buchanan?" "Miss Katherine Evans," Parker said flatly. Her wagon broke down. "She'll be staying the night." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, but she recovered quickly, years of propriety overcoming her surprise. "Of course. Let me show you to the guest room, Miss Evans, and I'll find you something dry to wear." As the women disappeared upstairs, Parker poured himself a glass of whiskey from the sideboard and stood before the fire in the main room. He stared into the flames, angry at the unwelcome feelings stirring within him at the sight of Katherine's smile. He had made a vow at Sarah's graveside, a promise that his heart was buried with her. For 3 years, he had kept that promise, turning away potential matches suggested by well-meaning friends, focusing instead on building his ranch into one of the most successful in the territory. Now a bedraggled stranger with a disarming smile had him questioning everything in the space of an hour. "Ridiculous," he muttered to himself, downing the whiskey in one swallow. Later, as Parker sat at the head of his dining table, he found himself sneaking glances at Katherine, now dressed in one of Mrs. Abernathy's spare dresses that had been taken in hastily at the waist. Her hair had been dried and styled simply, falling in loose waves past her shoulders. In the warm light of the dining room, he could see that her eyes weren't just blue, they were the deep blue of a mountain lake, flecked with hints of gray. "May I ask where you were headed, Miss Evans?" Mrs. Abernathy inquired, serving a bowl of stew. Katherine accepted the food gratefully. "To Helena. I've accepted a position as a teacher there." "A school teacher?" Parker found himself asking despite his determination to remain detached. She nodded. "Yes, I taught for 3 years in St. Louis before deciding a change of scenery was in order." "Mighty brave for a young woman to travel so far alone," Mrs. Abernathy commented. Katherine's smile returned, though tinged with something Parker couldn't quite identify. "Sometimes circumstances require bravery, Mrs. Abernathy." Parker noted the careful phrasing. "Running from something, Miss Evans?" Her eyes flashed to his, that defiance he'd glimpsed earlier returning in full force. "Aren't we all in one way or another, Mr. Buchanan?" The question hung in the air between them, uncomfortably perceptive. Parker cleared his throat and returned his attention to his meal. The conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, the condition of the roads, the growing town of Helena. Throughout the meal, Parker found his gaze drawn repeatedly to Katherine's face, particularly when she smiled or laughed at something Mrs. Abernathy said. Each time he forced himself to look away, annoyed at his own weakness. After dinner, Katherine insisted on helping Mrs. Abernathy with the dishes despite the older woman's protests. Parker retreated to his study, where he attempted to focus on his ledgers but found his thoughts continually straying to the woman in his kitchen. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his distraction. "Enter," he called, straightening in his chair. Katherine stood in the doorway, hesitant. "I wanted to thank you properly for your hospitality, Mr. Buchanan. Not everyone would have been so kind to a stranger." Parker rose from his desk, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "As I said, it was practical, nothing more." She stepped further into the room, her eyes taking in the bookshelves lining the walls. "You have an impressive collection, my wife's," Parker said before he could stop himself. The mention of Sarah aloud to a stranger felt like a betrayal, and he immediately regretted it. Katherine's expression softened. "I see, she has excellent taste." "Had," Parker corrected harshly. "She died 3 years ago." A moment of silence followed his blunt statement. Katherine didn't offer the usual platitudes or expressions of pity that Parker had come to despise. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes meeting his with understanding. "I lost my parents 2 years ago. Influenza," she said quietly. "The pain changes, but it doesn't disappear, does it?" The unexpected connection caught Parker off guard. He found himself answering honestly, "No, it doesn't." Katherine moved to one of the shelves, running her fingers lightly over the spines of the books. These were clearly loved. She pulled one volume partially out. Wuthering Heights. "This was my mother's favorite." "Sarah's too," Parker admitted, the name less painful to say the second time. Katherine replaced the book carefully. "Thank you for sharing this space with me, Mr. Buchanan. I'll leave you to your work." As she turned to go, Parker found himself speaking again. "What made you decide to come west, Miss Evans?" She paused in the doorway, considering her answer. "After my parents died, there was nothing keeping me in St. Louis. No family, few friends. I needed to start fresh somewhere new." That smile returned, gentle and tinged with determination. The West seemed like a good place for new beginnings. With that, she bid him good night and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Parker alone with thoughts more tumultuous than the storm still raging outside. Morning broke clear and crisp, the storm having passed in the night. Parker rose early as was his habit, surprised to find Katherine already in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Abernathy prepare breakfast. She wore the same hastily altered dress from the previous evening, her hair neatly braided and draped over one shoulder. "Good morning, Mr. Buchanan," she greeted him, that smile appearing again, now bright in the morning light streaming through the windows. Parker nodded, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Abernathy. "The creek will still be high, but the road should be passable by midday." "I'll have one of my men take you into town then. The blacksmith can help with your wagon." Katherine's smile faltered slightly. "Thank you, I appreciate that." After breakfast, Parker busied himself with the morning chores, assessing the damage from the storm and giving instructions to his ranch hands. He was checking a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree when he spotted Katherine walking across the yard toward him. She had exchanged the borrowed dress for her own, now dry but still showing the wrinkles from yesterday's soaking. As she approached, Parker noticed she carried a small bundle. "Mrs. Abernathy said you'd be out here," Katherine explained. "I wanted to return this." She held out the bundle, the wool blanket he'd given her in the barn. Parker accepted it with a nod. "You could have left it at the house." "I could have," she agreed, "but I wanted to see your ranch in the daylight. It's beautiful here." Despite himself, Parker felt a surge of pride. The Double B was the result of years of hard work, first with Sarah and then alone, driven by grief and determination. "It's good land." Katherine's gaze swept across the rolling pastures, the distant mountains still capped with snow even in late spring. "More than good, I'd say." "You've built something remarkable, Mr. Buchanan." Her sincere admiration struck another unexpected chord within him. Most women who had been paraded before him since Sarah's death had seen the ranch as a prize to be won along with a husband, not as the culmination of a dream and years of sweat. "Would you show me around?" Katherine asked, her expression earnest. "I've never been on a working ranch before." Parker hesitated, torn between his desire to maintain distance and a strange urge to share his creation with someone who seemed genuinely interested. "I have work to do." "Of course," she said, taking a step back. "I shouldn't have imposed." As she turned to leave, Parker found himself speaking against his better judgment. "The south pasture has the best view of the mountains. I need to check on the herd there anyway." The smile that lit her face made something in his chest twist painfully. "I'd like that very much." Parker saddled 2 horses, selecting his gentlest mare for Katherine. She surprised him by mounting with practiced ease, arranging her skirts as best she could. "You ride," he observed, swinging into his own saddle. "My father taught me when I was young," she explained, "though it's been some time since I've had the opportunity." They rode in companionable silence through the eastern meadow, the grass still wet with dew and rainwater. Katherine kept pace beside him, her posture relaxed in the saddle, occasionally glancing his way with a small smile when she caught him looking at her. As they crested a small rise, the full expanse of the south pasture spread before them, the cattle grazing peacefully against the backdrop of the distant mountains. Parker reined in his horse, allowing Katherine to take in the view. "It's breathtaking," she said softly, her eyes wide with appreciation. Parker found himself watching her face rather than the familiar landscape. The genuine wonder in her expression stirred something he had thought long dead. "How many acres?" she asked, turning to find him looking at her. Parker quickly shifted his gaze to the pasture. "The ranch is just over 6,000 acres now, started with 2,000 when Sarah and I first married, added more each year as we could afford it." "That's impressive," Katherine said. "You must have worked very hard." "We did," Parker acknowledged, the memory of those early years with Sarah working alongside him bittersweet. "After she died, I threw myself into expanding further, seemed the only thing worth doing." Katherine was quiet for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "And now?" The question caught him off guard. "Now, is it still the only thing worth doing?" she clarified gently. Parker stiffened in the saddle. "It's what I have." Katherine nodded, not pressing further. They rode on, checking the herd as Parker had intended. He found himself explaining aspects of ranch life, how he'd bred his cattle for hardiness in the Montana winters, his plans for expanding the horse breeding program, the challenges of getting supplies during the harsher months. Katherine proved to be an attentive listener, asking intelligent questions that revealed a quick mind. By the time they turned back toward the ranch house, Parker had spoken more than he had in months, surprised at how easily conversation flowed with this woman he'd known for less than a day. As they approached the barn, one of Parker's ranch hands came riding hard toward them, waving to get their attention. Parker tensed, immediately alert for trouble. "Mr. Buchanan," the young man called as he approached. "Just came from town. The Miller Creek Bridge is completely washed out. Won't be passable for at least 3 days, maybe a week. The whole East Road is underwater in places." Parker frowned, glancing at Katherine. "Any other routes to town clear?" The ranch hand shook his head. "North route had a landslide. South is the long way around, but parts are flooded too. Town's effectively cut off for now, except by horseback through the high trail, and that ain't safe for a lady." Katherine's face had paled slightly at the news. "I see." Parker dismissed the ranch hand with a nod of thanks, then turned to Katherine. "Seems you'll be our guest a bit longer than anticipated, Miss Evans." To his surprise, rather than looking distressed, Katherine's expression relaxed, and that smile, the one that had first disrupted his carefully constructed walls, returned. "I hope that won't be too much of an imposition, Mr. Buchanan." "It's practical," he said automatically, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. She laughed then, a clear, bright sound that startled him. "Yes, purely practical, nothing more." The teasing edge to her voice, gently mocking his own oft-repeated phrase, brought an unexpected warmth to Parker's cheeks. Without responding, he dismounted and moved to help her down from her horse. As his hands circled her waist, lifting her easily to the ground, their eyes met briefly before Parker hastily stepped back. "I'll let Mrs. Abernathy know you'll be staying," he said gruffly, leading both horses into the barn. That evening, dinner was a livelier affair than the previous night. Mrs. Abernathy, delighted to have female company, had prepared a more elaborate meal than usual. Katherine had helped, Parker learned, impressing the housekeeper with her cooking skills. Miss Evans made the apple pie herself, Mrs. Abernathy announced proudly as she served dessert. Using her mother's recipe, Katherine blushed slightly at the praise. Mrs. Abernathy did most of the work, I merely assisted. Nonsense, the older woman countered. The girl has a natural talent, Mr. Buchanan. Been a pleasure having her in my kitchen today. Parker took a bite of the pie, the flavors of cinnamon and apple melding perfectly on his tongue. It's excellent, he admitted, meeting Katherine's eyes across the table. Her smile of pleasure at the compliment made him look quickly back at his plate. After dinner, when Mrs. Abernathy had retired to her quarters in the small cottage behind the main house, Parker found himself alone with Katherine in the sitting room. She had taken up some mending that Mrs. Abernathy had set aside, her fingers moving deftly with needle and thread. Parker attempted to focus on his newspaper, but his attention kept straying to Katherine's bent head, the lamplight catching golden highlights in her hair. The domestic scene was painfully reminiscent of evenings spent with Sarah, yet different in a way he couldn't articulate. "You don't need to do that," he said finally, nodding toward the mending. Katherine looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "I don't mind. It seems the least I can do to earn my keep." "You're not a servant here," Parker said, more sharply than he'd intended. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "No, I'm an unexpected guest who's imposing on your hospitality, helping where I can seems only right." Parker set his newspaper aside, uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts. "Tell me about Helena," he said, changing the subject. "What do you know of the town?" Katherine set the mending in her lap. "Not as much as I should, perhaps. I know it's growing rapidly since the gold strikes. The school board wrote that they're expanding from 1 schoolhouse to 2 this summer, which is why they needed another teacher." "Do you have accommodations arranged?" She nodded. "The school provides a small house for female teachers. Nothing grand, but it will be my own." A shadow crossed her face. "After selling my parents' home, I've been boarding with a family in St. Louis. I'm looking forward to having my own space again." "No family at all?" Parker asked, realizing how little he knew about this woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life. Katherine shook her head. "I was an only child, as were both my parents. There are distant cousins somewhere back east, but we were never close." Her fingers traced the pattern on the fabric in her lap. "What about you, Mr. Buchanan? Do you have family?" "A brother in California," Parker replied. "We write occasionally. My parents died before Sarah and I married." "So you're alone here except for your staff?" The question, innocent as it was, struck at something raw within him. "I prefer it that way," he said stiffly. Katherine held his gaze steadily. "Do you?" Parker stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace. "You're very direct, Miss Evans." "A habit that has often gotten me into trouble," she acknowledged with a small smile. "But life is too short for unnecessary pretense, don't you think?" Parker stared into the fire, uncomfortable with her perception. "Sometimes pretense is necessary for survival." "Perhaps," she conceded. "But at what cost?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. After a moment, Katherine returned to her mending and Parker to his newspaper, though neither truly focused on their tasks. Later that night, Parker stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit landscape of his ranch. Katherine's words echoed in his mind. At what cost? The cost was clear to him: pain, the agony of loss that had nearly destroyed him when Sarah died. The vow he'd made at her graveside had been his shield, protecting him from ever feeling that devastation again. Yet in the space of a day, a stranger with summer blue eyes and a disarming smile had made him question the walls he'd built so carefully. It was unsettling, dangerous. 3 days passed with Katherine, a constant presence at the Double B Ranch. Despite Parker's initial resistance, she had quickly found ways to make herself useful, helping Mrs. Abernathy with household tasks, organizing Sarah's long-neglected library, and even assisting with the accounts when she discovered Parker struggling with some calculations. "I've always had a head for numbers," she explained when he reluctantly accepted her help after she spotted an error in his ledger. They fell into an unexpected rhythm, sharing meals, occasional rides to check on different parts of the ranch, and quiet evenings in the sitting room. Katherine proved to be well-read and articulate, engaging Parker in discussions about books, politics, and the changing West that stimulated his mind in ways he hadn't experienced in years. On the fourth morning, Parker found Katherine in the kitchen garden, helping Mrs. Abernathy harvest early vegetables. The sight of her kneeling in the dirt, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun, her sleeves rolled up and hands buried in the earth, affected him in a way he couldn't ignore. She looked as if she belonged there on his land in his garden. The thought terrified him. "Mr. Buchanan," Mrs. Abernathy called, noticing him standing at the garden gate, "just in time to carry these inside for us." Katherine looked up, shielding her eyes with a soil-smudged hand. When she smiled at him, Parker felt the final pieces of his carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. "Good morning," she said brightly. "We've found some lovely early peas and the last of the spring onions." Parker moved forward mechanically, accepting the basket Mrs. Abernathy thrust toward him. "Word from town is the bridge repairs are progressing faster than expected. Should be passable by tomorrow." Katherine's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, that's good news." "Indeed," Mrs. Abernathy said, though she cast a knowing glance between Parker and Katherine. "Though we'll miss your company, Miss Evans." "And I yours," Katherine replied, her eyes still on Parker's face. That afternoon, Parker deliberately busied himself with tasks far from the house, avoiding Katherine as much as possible. The news of the bridge reopening had thrown him into turmoil. He should be relieved that his unwanted guest would soon be on her way, that his solitary existence could resume uninterrupted. Instead, he found himself filled with a sense of impending loss that he refused to acknowledge. As evening approached, Parker found himself drawn to the small family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch. Sarah's grave was marked by a simple headstone of white marble, her name and dates etched deeply into the stone. Beside it, a smaller marker commemorated their unborn son. Parker knelt before the graves, removing his hat as he had done countless times over the past 3 years. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep within him. "I made you a promise." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and distant rain. Parker closed his eyes, remembering Sarah's face, her dark hair and gentle smile, so different from Katherine's golden warmth. He had loved Sarah with all the passion and certainty of youth, building dreams together that had been shattered in a single night of blood and loss. "She's leaving tomorrow," he continued, the words difficult to speak aloud. "And I should let her go. It's what I planned, what I want." The last words felt false even as he spoke them. A soft footfall behind him made Parker turn sharply. Katherine stood a few yards away, hesitation clear in her posture. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to intrude. Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you might be up here and dinner is ready, but I can go." Parker rose slowly, settling his hat back on his head. "It's all right." Katherine's eyes moved to the headstones, understanding dawning in her expression. "I truly am sorry for interrupting such a private moment." "You're leaving tomorrow," Parker said, the words coming out more accusingly than he'd intended. She nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "Yes, I need to get to Helena before the school term begins." "Of course." Parker moved past her, heading back toward the path to the house. "Mr. Buchanan," Katherine called after him, making him pause. "Parker." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice made him turn back to her. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Parker knew she was thanking him for more than just shelter from the storm or hospitality during her unexpected stay. She was acknowledging whatever unspoken connection had formed between them over these few short days, a connection he was still fighting with every fiber of his being. "You're welcome, Katherine," he replied, her name feeling right on his lips despite his resistance. They walked back to the house in silence, the setting sun casting long shadows before them. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair, Mrs. Abernathy carrying most of the conversation as neither Parker nor Katherine seemed inclined to speak much. After the meal, Parker excused himself to his study, seeking refuge in solitude and the familiar comfort of whiskey. He had barely poured his drink when a knock sounded at the door. Knowing who it would be, he hesitated before calling, "Enter." Katherine stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. She had changed for dinner into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair arranged in a style more elaborate than she had worn previously during her stay. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "For your hospitality these past days." "You already thanked me," Parker pointed out, taking a swallow of his whiskey. "Yes," Katherine moved further into the room, her hands clasped before her, "but I also wanted to say, I've enjoyed my time here more than I expected to." Parker set his glass down harder than necessary. "It was a practical arrangement, nothing more." "Was it?" Katherine challenged, taking another step closer. "Is that truly all it was to you?" The directness of her question, coupled with her proximity, made Parker's carefully maintained control begin to slip. "What do you want from me, Katherine?" "The truth," she said simply. "Before I leave tomorrow, just once, I want the truth from you." Parker turned away, moving to the window where the last light of day was fading from the sky. "The truth is complicated." "It usually is," she agreed, coming to stand beside him at the window, "but I think I deserve it, and so do you." Her scent, a mixture of lavender soap and something uniquely her, filled his senses, making it difficult to maintain his distance. "I made a vow," he said finally, the words painful to speak aloud to anyone but Sarah's ghost. "When my wife died, I swore I would never love again. That I couldn't bear it." Katherine was silent for a long moment, and now Parker turned to look at her, finding her much closer than he expected. "Now I'm afraid." The admission cost him dearly, but once spoken, the words seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders. "Of what?" Katherine asked softly. "Of feeling anything at all," Parker answered honestly. "For 3 years I've existed rather than lived. It was easier that way, safer." "And now," she repeated, her eyes never leaving his face. Parker reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "Now a stranger walks into my barn during a storm, smiles at me, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about myself is in question." Katherine's breath caught at his touch. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she reminded him, though her voice held a question. "I know," Parker said, his hand dropping back to his side. "You have a position waiting, a new life in Helena." She searched his face, looking for something Parker wasn't sure he could give her. "Is that all you have to say to me?" Parker stepped back, the fear resurging. "What would you have me say? That in the space of 5 days, you've made me question a vow I've held sacred for 3 years. That the thought of you leaving tomorrow feels like losing something precious before I've even had the chance to hold it." The raw honesty of his words hung in the air between them. Katherine's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly what I would have you say if it's the truth." Parker turned away, unable to bear the hope in her eyes. "It changes nothing. You're still leaving tomorrow." "It changes everything," Katherine countered, her voice stronger now, "unless you're too afraid to acknowledge it." The challenge in her words struck at Parker's pride. He turned back to her, eyes narrowed. "You think it's that simple? That I can just set aside a promise made at my wife's grave because a pretty schoolteacher smiles at me?" "No," Katherine said, unflinching in the face of his anger. "I think it's terribly complicated and painful and frightening, but I also think that sometimes life gives us second chances if we're brave enough to take them." She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "I'll be gone by mid-morning tomorrow." "Whatever you decide, Parker Buchanan, I wish you happiness." With that, she left, closing the door softly behind her. Parker stood frozen in place, her words echoing in his mind. Sometimes life gives us second chances if we're brave enough to take them. He poured another whiskey, drinking it in one swallow before sinking into his chair, his head in his hands. Dawn broke clear and golden over the Double B Ranch. Parker had slept poorly, his dreams haunted by 2 women, one a bittersweet memory, the other a living, breathing challenge to everything he thought he believed about himself. He rose early, dressing with unusual care before heading downstairs. The house was quiet, Mrs. Abernathy not yet arrived from her cottage to start breakfast. Parker moved to the kitchen, stoking the fire in the stove and putting on coffee, a task he rarely performed himself. As the rich aroma of brewing coffee filled the kitchen, Parker heard footsteps on the stairs. Katherine appeared in the doorway, already dressed for travel in the blue dress she had worn when she first arrived, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. She looked surprised to find him there. "Good morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," Parker admitted, pouring 2 cups of coffee and offering one to her. Katherine accepted the cup, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Thank you." They sat at the kitchen table, an echo of their first morning together when the situation had been reversed, Katherine helping with breakfast while Parker had been the late arrival. "Your wagon has been repaired," Parker said after a moment of silence. "One of my men brought it back yesterday. The wheel's been replaced and everything checked over." "That's very kind of you," Katherine replied, her eyes on her coffee cup. "It was practical," Parker said, a hint of irony in his voice as he echoed his own oft-repeated phrase. Katherine looked up, a small smile playing at her lips despite the sadness in her eyes. Of course, nothing more. The familiar exchange, weighted now with unspoken meaning, hung between them. Parker took a deep breath, setting his cup down carefully. "I visited Sarah's grave again last night," he said, the words difficult but necessary. "After you left." Katherine's expression softened with understanding. "I see." "No, you don't," Parker continued, his voice low and intense. "I went there to ask her forgiveness for breaking my vow." Katherine's breath caught, her eyes widening slightly. "Parker, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "For 3 years I've been half alive, Katherine, existing, not living, telling myself it was loyalty to Sarah's memory when really it was fear of feeling that pain again." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Then you walked into my barn, soaking wet and defiant, and smiled at me like you could see right through every wall I'd built." Katherine's fingers tightened around his. "I didn't mean to disrupt your life," she said softly. "Yes, you did," Parker countered with the ghost of a smile. "Maybe not consciously, but from the moment you stood in my barn wringing water from your dress, you've been challenging everything I thought I knew about myself. And what do you know now?" Katherine asked, the question barely above a whisper. Parker's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "That Sarah would want me to live, not just exist. That honoring her memory doesn't mean shutting myself away from the possibility of happiness." He met Katherine's eyes directly. "That I'm not ready to say goodbye to you." A single tear slipped down Katherine's cheek. "I have obligations in Helena, a contract signed, a position to fill." "I know," Parker acknowledged, his heart sinking despite having expected this response. "I wouldn't ask you to abandon your commitments." "That's not the kind of woman you are, and it's not what I want." "What do you want, Parker?" Katherine asked, echoing his question from the night before. Parker stood, moving around the table to kneel beside her chair. Taking both her hands in his, he looked up into her eyes. "Time, a chance. Helena is less than a day's ride from here. The school term ends for summer break in 6 weeks. I'm asking if you'd consider coming back then, staying longer, seeing if whatever has started between us could grow into something real." Katherine's free hand moved to his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "You're asking me to court you properly?" Parker turned his face to press a kiss against her palm. "I'm asking for the chance to court you, yes, to write to you in the meantime. To see if what I'm feeling is truly the beginning of something worth building a life around." Katherine's smile, the same one that had first cracked his defenses, bloomed across her face, bright with hope and something deeper that made Parker's heart race. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." Parker rose, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. For a moment they stood there, the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, illuminating the beginning of something neither had expected to find. "I should warn you," Katherine said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I'm stubborn and opinionated and sometimes speak before I think." Parker chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. "I never would have guessed." She pulled back enough to look into his face, her expression suddenly serious. "And I can't replace her, Parker. I wouldn't want to try." "I know," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're not Sarah, you're Katherine Evans with your own light, your own strength. I'm not asking you to replace anyone. I'm asking for the chance to know you and to let you know me. Katherine nodded, satisfaction and understanding in her eyes. Then I accept your proposal, Mr. Buchanan. Letters, visits when possible, and a proper courtship beginning this summer. Parker's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her smile. May I kiss you, Miss Evans? To seal our agreement, Katherine's eyes sparkled with a mixture of mischief and tenderness. I believe that would be entirely appropriate, Mr. Buchanan. Parker lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was gentle yet full of promise. Katherine's arms wound around his neck, her body fitting against his as if designed to be there. When they finally parted, both were breathless, and Parker rested his forehead against hers. I'll drive you to Helena myself, he said, reluctant to let her go but knowing it was necessary. See where you'll be living, make sure it's suitable. Katherine laughed, the sound filling the kitchen with warmth. Very practical of you. Nothing practical about it, Parker admitted with a rueful smile. I just want every possible moment with you before we have to rely on letters. Mrs. Abernathy's arrival interrupted any further conversation, the housekeeper taking in their close proximity with a knowing smile that suggested she had anticipated this development. Breakfast will be ready shortly, she announced, bustling about the kitchen with unusual energy. Can't have Miss Evans traveling on an empty stomach. The journey to Helena took most of the day, with Parker driving Katherine's repaired wagon. The time passed quickly, filled with conversation that ranged from childhood memories to future dreams. Parker found himself talking more than he had in years, sharing stories of his early days on the ranch, his hopes for expanding his horse breeding program, even his secret dream of someday building a larger house on the property. With a proper library, he admitted, slightly embarrassed by his enthusiasm, and maybe a music room. Sarah played the piano, but after she died, I couldn't bear to keep the instrument in the house. Katherine listened attentively, offering her own thoughts and questions. Do you play any instruments? She asked. Parker shook his head. Never had the talent for it. My brother Philip was the musical one in the family. I play the violin, Katherine said with a small smile. Not exceptionally well, but I enjoy it. I had to sell my instrument after my parents died, to help with expenses. Parker filed away this information, already forming plans in his mind. As they approached Helena, the town's growth was evident in the number of new buildings and the busy streets. Parker felt a pang of worry, seeing Katherine's new home for the first time. It was larger and more developed than he had imagined, offering opportunities and distractions he couldn't provide at his isolated ranch. As if reading his thoughts, Katherine placed her hand over his on the reins. It's just a place, Parker, not a home. The simple statement eased some of his concern. The schoolhouse was a new 2-story building near the center of town, with the teacher's residence a small but tidy cottage situated just behind it. The school board chairman, Mr. Peterson, was expecting Katherine and greeted them warmly, though his eyebrows rose at Parker's introduction as a friend from near Miller Creek. We're fortunate Miss Evans arrived in time for the start of term, Mr. Peterson commented as he showed them the cottage. When we didn't hear from her after the storm, we were concerned she might have been delayed. Mr. Buchanan was kind enough to offer shelter when my wagon broke down, Katherine explained, her tone professional though her eyes held a special warmth when they met Parker's. The cottage was simple but comfortable, with a small parlor, kitchen, bedroom, and study. Parker noted with approval that it appeared well maintained, though the furniture was sparse. The previous teacher left some basics, Mr. Peterson explained, but you'll want to add your own touches, of course. It's perfect, Katherine assured him, though Parker could see her mentally cataloging what she would need to acquire. After Mr. Peterson left them to settle in, Parker brought in Katherine's trunk and the few supplies they had purchased on their way through town. The small space felt intimate with just the two of them, a preview of what might someday be their shared life. Will you be all right here? Parker asked, unable to keep the concern from his voice. Katherine moved to stand before him, taking his hands in hers. I will be. And in 6 weeks, I'll come to the ranch for the summer if your invitation still stands. It does, Parker assured her, drawing her closer, though 6 weeks seems an eternity right now. We have letters, she reminded him with a smile. And you promised to visit when you come to town for supplies. Parker nodded, memorizing the details of her face as if he might forget them in their time apart. I should go, he said reluctantly. It's a long ride back, and you need to settle in before school starts tomorrow. Katherine rose on her tiptoes, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. Thank you, Parker, for everything. He held her close for a moment longer, then forced himself to step back. I'll write as soon as I return home. At the door, he turned back for one last look. Katherine stood in the center of her new cottage, sunlight streaming through the windows to illuminate her figure. She smiled that same smile that had first breached his defenses in the barn, and Parker knew with sudden certainty that his life had irrevocably changed for the better. Until summer, he said, a promise in the words. Until summer, she echoed, her eyes bright with the same promise. The weeks that followed were filled with letters, each one a thread strengthening the connection between them. Parker wrote of daily life on the ranch, the birth of new foals, the progress of the spring calves, the repairs to fences damaged in the storm. Katherine shared stories of her students, the challenges and joys of teaching in a frontier town, and her gradual settling into Helena society. Parker made the journey to town twice during those 6 weeks, each visit confirming what his heart already knew, that Katherine Evans had become essential to his happiness in a way he had never thought possible again. On his second visit, he brought a gift, a violin he had commissioned from a craftsman in Bozeman, having it delivered specially to the ranch. Katherine's tears of joy as she carefully removed the instrument from its case, running her fingers lovingly over the polished wood, convinced Parker that he had made the right choice. It's beautiful, she whispered, raising it to her shoulder and drawing the bow across the strings in a tentative note. Parker, I don't know what to say. Say you'll play for me someday, he replied, his heart full at her evident pleasure. I will, she promised, setting the instrument carefully aside to throw her arms around his neck. Thank you. As the end of the school term approached, Parker found himself filled with both anticipation and nervousness. He had Mrs. Abernathy help prepare the guest room Katherine had used during her unexpected stay, but added new curtains and a fresh quilt to make the space more welcoming. The housekeeper watched his fussing with undisguised amusement. Never thought I'd see the day, she commented as Parker inspected the newly arranged flowers in Katherine's room for the third time. You're smitten, Mr. Buchanan. Parker couldn't deny it. She's special, Mrs. Abernathy. The older woman nodded approvingly. That she is. And about time you noticed such a thing was possible again. The day Katherine was due to arrive, Parker rode out to meet her halfway, unwilling to wait any longer than necessary. When he spotted her wagon coming around a bend in the road, his heart leaped in his chest like a boy's. Katherine reined in her horse when she saw him, her face lighting with a smile that outshone the summer sun. You're early, she called as he approached. Parker urged his horse forward, coming alongside her wagon. Couldn't wait, he admitted simply. Katherine's laugh was the sweetest sound he'd heard in weeks. Neither could I. School ended yesterday, but I was packed and ready to leave 3 days ago. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch side by side, conversation flowing easily between them as if they had never been apart. When the main house came into view, Katherine sighed with evident pleasure. It looks like a painting, she said, taking in the scene of the white farmhouse against the backdrop of rolling pastures and distant mountains. I've dreamed of this view. Parker felt a surge of pride and hope. Welcome back to the Double B, Katherine. That summer passed in a golden haze of deepening affection and shared experiences. Katherine fit seamlessly into ranch life, her natural abilities and willingness to learn endearing her to everyone from Mrs. Abernathy to the roughest ranch hands. She spent mornings helping with household tasks or riding with Parker to check on different parts of the property, afternoons reading or playing her violin on the wide front porch, and evenings engaged in conversation that often lasted well into the night. Parker found himself falling more deeply in love with each passing day. He loved Catherine's intelligence and wit, her kindness toward everyone she met, her determination when learning new skills, and the passion that animated her when discussing everything from literature to politics. Most of all, he loved the way she made him feel alive again, with a future worth planning for. One evening in late July, Parker took Katherine riding to his favorite spot on the property, a small meadow overlooking a bend in the creek, where wildflowers grew in abundance, and the sunset painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. He had packed a picnic, which they enjoyed as the day's heat began to fade into a pleasant summer evening. "I've been thinking," Parker said as they sat side by side on a blanket spread over the grass. "About the future." Katherine turned to look at him, her expression curious. "What about it?" Parker took her hand, his thumb tracing the delicate bones of her wrist. "School starts again in 3 weeks. "Yes," Katherine acknowledged, a shadow crossing her face. "I've been trying not to think about leaving." "What if you didn't have to?" Parker asked, his voice low and intense. "What if this could be your home permanently?" Katherine's breath caught, her eyes widening. "Parker," he shifted to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I love you, Katherine Evans. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you smiled at me in my barn, even though I fought against it with everything I had. These past months have shown me that what I feel isn't just gratitude for bringing me back to life or comfort in your company. It's deeper than that. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Are you proposing, Mr. Buchanan?" Parker reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I am, Miss Evans." He opened the box to reveal a ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds set in gold. "This was my grandmother's. I had it sized for you." Katherine gasped softly at the sight of the ring, then looked up to meet his eyes. "What about my teaching position, the contract I signed?" "I spoke with Mr. Peterson when I was in town last week," Parker admitted. "Explained the situation. He said they'd be sorry to lose you, but could find a replacement if given enough notice. Said something about a young woman from back east who had inquired about positions for the spring term." "You've thought of everything," Katherine said, wonder in her voice. "I tried to," Parker replied. "I want you to be happy, Katherine. If teaching is what you need, we can find a way. The town school is looking for help, or we could start something here for the ranch children. But selfishly, I want you here with me every day." Katherine's free hand moved to cup his cheek, her touch infinitely tender. "Parker Buchanan, I love you with all my heart. Yes, I will marry you." Parker slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the joy and promise he felt in that moment. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked simply. Katherine smiled, her eyes alight with happiness. "Soon, before school would start, so I can send word to Mr. Peterson immediately. I don't want to wait." "Neither do I," Parker agreed fervently. 2 weeks, we can be ready by then." 2 weeks, Katherine confirmed with a laugh. "Mrs. Abernathy will be scandalized by the rush." "Mrs. Abernathy has been planning this wedding since the day you left for Helena," Parker revealed with a grin. "I think she had the menu planned before I even bought the ring." Katherine's laughter rang out across the meadow, joyous and free. "Then 2 weeks it is, Mr. Buchanan. I can't wait to be your wife." The wedding took place on a perfect August day, with the entire ranch turned out for the celebration. Parker had invited neighboring ranchers and townspeople, while Katherine had formed friendships during her brief time in Helena that brought several guests from town. Even Parker's brother Philip made the journey from California, meeting Katherine for the first time the day before the ceremony and immediately approving of his brother's choice. "She's brought you back to life," Philip observed as they shared a drink on the porch the night before the wedding. "I can see it in your eyes." Parker couldn't deny it. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted. "After Sarah," Philip clasped his shoulder in understanding. "Sarah would approve, you know, she only ever wanted your happiness." The simple ceremony was held in the garden Mrs. Abernathy had tended with such care, now bursting with late summer blooms. Katherine wore a gown of ivory silk that had been hastily but expertly altered by the town dressmaker. Her honey-blonde hair adorned with wildflowers gathered from the meadow where Parker had proposed. As Parker watched her walk toward him, her eyes shining with love and promise, he felt the last vestiges of his old vow dissolve into something new, not a betrayal of his past, but an embrace of his future. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. "We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words washed over Parker as he held Katherine's hands in his, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a storm-tossed night when a bedraggled stranger had walked into his barn, to this sunlit day when she would become his wife, the path had been unexpected but perfect in its own way. "I, Parker, take you, Katherine, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Katherine's voice was clear and confident as she repeated her own vows, her eyes never leaving his face. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Parker pulled her into his arms, sealing their union with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing under lanterns strung throughout the garden. As twilight deepened into night, Parker found Katherine standing at the edge of the gathering, looking out over the ranch that was now her home. "Happy Mrs. Buchanan?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. Katherine leaned back against his chest with a contented sigh. "Completely, Mr. Buchanan." Parker pressed a kiss to her temple. "I never thought I'd have this again," he admitted quietly. "A partner. A future to look forward to." Katherine turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. "When I started west, I was looking for a new beginning, but I never imagined finding you. It feels like everything in my life was leading me to that stormy night and your barn. Divine intervention." Parker suggested with a smile. "Perhaps," Katherine agreed, "or just extraordinarily good luck." Parker drew her closer, his heart full beyond measure. "Either way, I'm grateful, for the storm, for your broken wagon wheel, for your smile that first night." He kissed her softly. "Especially for your smile." Music drifted from the celebration behind them, and Parker extended his hand in invitation. "Dance with me, Mrs. Buchanan." Katherine placed her hand in his, her wedding ring catching the light of the lanterns. "Always, Mr. Buchanan, always." As they rejoined their guests, moving together in perfect harmony, Parker reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a vow made in grief never to love again to a promise made in joy to love for a lifetime. Katherine had indeed shattered his oath with a smile, and in doing so had given him a second chance at happiness he had never thought possible. The stars shone overhead, witnesses to a new beginning born from an unexpected encounter in a storm-swept barn. And as Parker held his bride in his arms, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, their love a shelter stronger than any storm. Epilogue: 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows of the newly expanded ranch house as Parker rode in from the south pasture. The Double B had prospered in the 5 years since Katherine had become his wife, growing in both size and reputation. Parker's horse breeding program had gained recognition throughout the territory, while the cattle operation had expanded to include new bloodlines that thrived in the Montana climate. As he dismounted in front of the barn, Parker smiled at the sight that greeted him on the wide front porch of the main house. Katherine sat in a rocking chair, their 10-month-old daughter Sarah cradled in her arms, while 3-year-old James, named for Katherine's father, played with wooden blocks at her feet. Beside them, Mrs. Abernathy shelled peas for dinner, her conversation with Katherine punctuated by the baby's happy gurgles. This was what happiness looked like, Parker reflected as he removed his hat and headed toward his family. Not the solitary existence he had once believed was his only option, but this vibrant, messy, joyful life shared with the woman who had walked into his barn during a storm and changed everything. "Papa," James shouted, spotting him first and abandoning his blocks to race down the porch steps. Parker scooped his son into his arms, tossing him high before settling him on his shoulders. "Have you been helping your mama today, little man?" James nodded solemnly. "I watched Sarah while mama played violin." "Very responsible," Parker approved, climbing the steps to where Katherine watched them with a smile that still made his heart skip a beat after all this time. "Welcome home," she said, rising to accept his kiss. Baby Sarah reached for him, her chubby hands opening and closing in demand. Parker took his daughter in one arm, keeping James balanced on his shoulders with the other. "How are my girls today?" "Wonderful," Katherine replied, her eyes taking in the picture they made her husband with their children. Sarah took 3 steps holding onto the furniture, and we had a letter from Helena. "The school board is hosting a recital and wants me to play at the opening." During their 2nd year of marriage, Katherine had begun teaching music to the children on neighboring ranches, her natural talent for education finding an outlet that allowed her to remain at the Double B. Her occasional performances in Helena had become anticipated events in the growing cultural life of the town. "You'll play beautifully," Parker said with confidence. "When is it?" "Next month," Katherine replied. "I thought we might make it a family trip. James has been asking to ride on the train." "Train," James echoed enthusiastically from his perch on Parker's shoulders. Parker laughed, shifting Sarah to a more comfortable position as she began to play with the buttons on his shirt. "I think that can be arranged. The new breeding stock will be settled by then, and Hank can manage for a few days." Mrs. Abernathy rose, gathering her bowl of peas. "I'll start dinner. You two enjoy this fine evening with the little ones." As the housekeeper disappeared inside, Parker settled into the rocking chair Katherine had vacated, balancing Sarah on his lap while James climbed down to return to his blocks. "I stopped by the cemetery on my way in," Parker said quietly, watching as Katherine took the chair beside him. "Told Sarah about James's new trick of climbing the corral fence when he thinks no one is looking." Katherine smiled, reaching over to take his free hand. It had become a tradition for Parker to visit Sarah's grave occasionally, sharing news of their growing family and the ranch. Far from feeling threatened by this connection to his first wife, Katherine had encouraged it, understanding that Parker's capacity for love had room for both his past and his present. "She would be proud of the father you are," Katherine said softly. "Of the man you are." Parker squeezed her hand, overwhelmed as he sometimes still was by the depth of his love for this woman and the life they had built together. "I wouldn't be either without you, Kate, you know that." Katherine's smile, the same one that had first cracked his defenses in a rain-soaked barn, bloomed across her face. "We saved each other, I think." Parker nodded, watching as the setting sun painted the ranch in golden light. From the bunkhouse came the sound of a harmonica, one of the hands playing a cheerful tune to end the day. Inside the house, Mrs. Abernathy was preparing a meal for the family that had grown in both size and happiness under her watchful eye. And here on the porch, everything Parker had never dared to hope for again was within arm's reach. "I love you," he said simply, the words still powerful despite their daily use. "And I love you," Katherine replied, her eyes reflecting the same wonder he felt at their shared journey. As twilight descended over the Double B ranch, Parker Buchanan held his youngest child close, his wife's hand in his, and his son playing contentedly at his feet. The oath he had made in grief had been shattered by a smile and replaced by a different kind of promise, one of love, family, and a future brighter than he had ever imagined possible. And as the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, Parker gave thanks for broken wagon wheels, summer storms, and the courage of a woman who had walked into his barn and into his heart, bringing light back into a world he had resigned to darkness.